Welcome to the Family Front. My name is Hannah Bruck, and I work as a policy scholar specializing in family policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Today, we're going to be discussing something deeply connected to the future of Texas: family, freedom, and the American dream. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Brad Wilcox, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, as well as the director for the National Marriage Project. He's a key researcher in TPPF's family team's newest paper, For the Sake of Kids: Strengthening Families in the Lone Star State, as well as a prolific author, most recently writing his book, Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Communities, and Save Civilization. Welcome, Dr. Wilcox.
It's good to be here, Hannah.
Good to have you. So your work focuses on taking a deep dive into the lives of families and into the issue of marriage. I want to start kind of with a broad picture question. What does the data tell us about how families are doing today?
So there's really kind of good news and bad news to report on the family front, Hannah. On the bad news front, I think we are kind of seeing, as you were mentioning, this sort of like what I would call the closing of the American heart, where I think for too many adults, too many young adults, it looks like kind of dating and marriage and family life are kind of beyond their reach. We're projecting now that about a third of young adults will never marry and about a quarter of young adults will never have children. These are kind of record numbers, and they're cause for concern because adults who are married with kids, despite some of the messages you get in the mainstream media and sort of social media, are much more likely to be both living meaningful lives and happy lives. So that's sort of the bad news, is that kind of, I think, for a variety of reasons, marriage and family life have kind of become more of a luxury good, as we might say. The good news, though, is that for our kids, we're actually seeing an end to the family revolution of the last really 60 years. So from the 1960s until about 2014, we saw more and more family instability, more and more chaos on the family front. But since about 2014, we've seen kind of the share of kids being raised in stable, married families by their own parents is up. And so kind of on the family front, we can kind of, I think, appreciate that the family is stabilizing, marriage is stabilizing, divorce is down. And so for the folks who are kind of moving forward with, starting families, having families, things look better and brighter for that more selective group of Americans today.
Wow, that's great. You wrote that as families go, so goes the nation.
Right.
And kind of thinking about that concept coming out of this period of time where marriage was in a decline, and now 2014 where we're moving up, what are some of the damages that we've seen economically or socially that happen as a byproduct of low levels of marriage or family formation?
Yeah, so if you think about kind of Jefferson's famous words in the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, sort of three core kind of American ideals or values. What we have seen on the life front, for instance, is a dramatic increase in recent decades in what are called deaths of despair, where Americans are either killing themselves or they're drinking themselves, to death, or they're experiencing a drug overdose. So these kind of deaths of despair are obviously kind of like a key indicator that something in our country is wrong. And we look at like what are the biggest predictors of deaths of despair in America. It's not about race, it's not about money, it's about family. What we see is that Americans who are not married, especially working class men who are not married, are way more likely to succumb to these deaths of despair. So that's sort of, I think, one consequence of this retreat from marriage that's kind of befallen the country in recent decades. Another important point is that what we see is that the American dream is really out of reach for a lot of poor kids growing up in communities where single parenthood is the norm. And by contrast, the American dream for poor kids is much more within reach if they're surrounded by families that are stable and intact. So that's kind of I think another kind of key indicator. And then finally, in terms of the pursuit of happiness, what we're seeing is that happiness is down in America, and the number one factor, this is from a recent study in Chicago, is, again, the fact that fewer Americans are married. So again, the idea is that when marriage and family are weaker, we're more likely to see people suffering on a number of fronts, and the American dream is less likely to be within people's grasp.
What would you say to people that may believe, or that would say that this kind of crisis has never been seen before? What kind of encouragement could you give to maybe someone who's questioning the legitimacy of kind of this reemergence of the importance of these values?
So I think what happens oftentimes is that when, when things get bad enough, people both individually and collectively realize we've got to do something differently. And so I think we are seeing a return to family in some parts of this country, and also a return to faith as well. And both of those two core institutions are incredibly important to sort of the social and the emotional and the broader kind of civic life of the country. So on the religious front, for instance, there is certainly plenty of evidence indicating that the sort of decline in religious attendance from this really the late 60s until the recent president has leveled off, and maybe even maybe again turning upwards. As I said, on the family structure front, we are seeing a growing share of kids being raised in stable married families. So I think that's good news. And even on the marriage rate, it looks like it may have bottomed out there. Actually, during COVID, it's kind of come up since COVID. We're just kind of like we're sort of watching the marriage rate to sort of see where it goes. So there's always a possibility with basically, Taylor Swift's wedding looming, with Charlie Kirk's, really powerful message about marriage and family kind of emerging even more after his death. That these sort of cultural influences might encourage young adults kind of, in your generation to figure out a way to get married and start a family. So we'll see on the marriage front. But certainly on the family front and on the religion front, we do have some signs that we're kind of turning a corner for the better.
Yeah. And I think that kind of a pulse on culture is so important. And I think that it's been very encouraging to see kind of those mainstream icons like Taylor Swift say things that are more positive about marriage. Like in her most recent album, she had a song that was very pro-marriage, a house, a kids, in a good neighborhood, building that community. Right. Kind of with that momentum, that cultural momentum, what are some things that we can be thinking about kind of in building good policy to continue this? And I know that you have written and spoke nationally about this concept of the success sequence. Could you tell me a little bit more about what that is, the value that it adds? Yep.
Sure, yeah. So, and I think, the challenges facing the family are obviously manifold. One of those challenges is cultural. And I think kind of trying to help people understand and appreciate that there are kind of 3 steps that they can take to maximize their odds of both realizing the American dream financially, but also to realize, their odds of forging a strong family that puts them in a good spot, basically emotionally as well. And so what we see for young adults today is that if they follow that sequence, they have about a 97% chance of kind of avoiding poverty in their late 20s and their 30s, which I think is encouraging, and about an 86% shot of reaching the middle class or higher. So again, by getting at least a high school degree, working full-time in your 20s, and getting married before having any children, you're kind of really maximizing your odds of doing well financially, of establishing some kind of financial foundation that's going to keep you secure and strong. But obviously there's more to life than money. And it's also important to understand and appreciate that people who are kind of following the sequence, especially who are putting marriage before the baby carriage, are much more likely to be forging a stable marriage and family life, about twice as likely, compared to their fellow peers who are having kids, before marriage, for instance. So we have to kind of just appreciate how, marriage today is an important way to get off on the right start when it comes to forming a family. So I think that's one point to make. And then we're also seeing too is that young adults who are kind of taking care of those boxes, that education box, checking that box, the work box, and the marriage box, are just much better off in terms of both their happiness and avoiding emotional distress. So young adults who are not following those steps are, more than twice as likely to be kind of emotionally distressed compared to their young adult peers who are kind of following the sequence. And so it's not just marriage here, too, I think that's worth talking about. It's also, especially I would say, too, the way in which a lot of young adults today are not employed full time. And this is, I think, particularly a problem for young men today, often in their early mid-20s. And so we've got to kind of basically underline the importance to them of sort of seeking out work that is full-time and is going to kind of lead them to, a better place, both personally and financially. So not just sort of like staying, for instance, in a part-time job in retail, for instance, or a part-time job, in the in the food sector, basically. Those two sectors, and I mention them in particular because we just did a report at the Institute for Family Studies on this, are the ones that are the least conducive when it comes to working class men's odds of getting married and having a family. So it's just important for young men to realize, again, that you got to get some kind of education, preferably either a college degree or some kind of vocational training, where you're learning a real skill that has value in the labor market today. And then where you're working full time, you're kind of intentional about trying to kind of get there on time, work hard, get a reputation for being a good worker, a reliable worker, and then getting some skills that allow you to kind of move up the ladder, financially and become, especially again for men, like deemed to be worthy of dating and especially, marriage and becoming a reliable provider for your family.
Right. Those numbers are so significant, that 97% avoiding poverty, 86 reaching the middle class.
Right.
Why do you think it is that more young people kind of are not as clued into this? I've heard people describe our economy. It's interesting that you brought up kind of this idea of job security. I've heard them describe our economy as a gig economy. So people are much less interested in the regular 9 to 5, clocking in, clocking out. What do you think are the elements that...
So I think there are two issues, particularly with the work piece and the marriage piece and the success sequence that, are not always appreciated or comprehended today, both in the broader society and for young adults in particular. So on the marriage side, I was talking to, a decent sized class of mine at UVA. I was sort of asking them, well, in high school, did you hear anything about marriage, like marriage per se? And basically no one in the class had heard. There was no school-wide assembly on marriage. They didn't hear, virtually anything about marriage in their classes. It was just kind of like not part of their public school conversations. I think part of the challenge facing adults is they may have seen marriage, in their own families or in their broader friendship network. And they probably have some good models of marriage and then some not so good models of marriage in that context. But kind of they've not been sort of taught about the public value of marriage for the broader country. They've not been taught kind of any of the skills that would allow them to, find a good spouse and then to be a good spouse. So they're just kind of like, a lot of them would like to get married and they think it's a good thing, but they don't have any kind of clear ideas about how to do that. So I think one value of the success sequence is kind of just basically putting marriage onto the front burner, if you will. And kind of alerting them to its importance. But then on the work side, I think, a lot of young adults who don't have a college degree are kind of just drifting into the labor market and they're working kind of in the more gig type jobs. They're just working on a part-time basis. Sometimes it's because the companies they're working for are not really interested in scheduling them on a full-time basis. And that's part of, I think, the challenge we're facing. But there's also, I think, kind of a dynamic too where a lot of young adults are not really trying to kind of get to work on time and to be reliable workers. And so then they're not kind of promoted to positions where they're working that would kind of put them on more of a full-time track and more of an upward, mobility track, both personally and financially. So I think they've got to also recognize, like, the more you take your work seriously, whether it's working at Starbucks or SpaceX, the more you'll be noticed as a good worker, hard worker, and you'll be typically, I think, promoted, and you'll see a better financial future for yourself as well.
As we kind of think about this concept of the success sequence, I know that you mentioned kind of the importance of having it instituted in curriculum at schools.
Right.
How many touch points are we looking for, and what does good training look like for teachers as they incorporate this into their classes?
So I think, it would be great to have it basically in middle school, and then I would say like around 10th grade and 12th grade. And you could be kind of in a health class, it could be in some kind of relationships or family class, also in a financial literacy class as well, kind of understanding how much kind of doing things in the right order is really helpful in establishing a firm financial foundation. So these are kind of different ways and times and places that it could be incorporated into our schools, both public, I would say, and private. And I think in many cases, you could have like the success sequence kind of woven into, existing classes in either in health or in family or relationships or in financial literacy. It doesn't have to be kind of like a standalone. So just kind of like people become acquainted with the notion. They understand and appreciate that there is a pathway forward that's going to allow them to achieve a measure of financial security. It's going to allow them to avoid the family instability they've maybe seen in their own home or in their community. And it's also going to give them a pathway to being more emotionally resilient and to live a happier life. Because again, a certain measure of education, work, and marriage are powerfully related to flourishing, not just financially, but also emotionally. And a lot of young adults don't know that, and they don't understand and appreciate that. You've got to take both your approach to work, I think, seriously, and you've got to take your approach to dating and relationships and marriage seriously, and not kind of just treat them in a casual or haphazard fashion, because that's often going to put you in a bad spot when it comes to either work or love.
What would you say to someone who might believe or might say that the success sequence is a way to impose a normative or purely Christian vision for marriage and families into the school system? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, and that's really a kind of a critique that it's like seen as a conservative and or a Christian kind of perspective. And I think what that critique doesn't appreciate is that this is not a Christian thing. I mean, if you look obviously at Asia, for instance, most Asian societies put a premium on a certain measure of education and certainly work and certainly marriage. So this is not like some kind of like distinctly Christian thing. And then I think too, what it doesn't sort of fully appreciate also is that the success sequence has, in polling that's been done by the American Enterprise Institute, for instance, has the sort of support of the general public. It has the support of parents, single parents. It has the support of white Americans, Hispanic Americans, Black Americans. This is not some kind of like, thing that is, only kind of supported by some minority of conservative Christians. This has kind of like a general, I think, resonance. I mean, most people can understand and appreciate that. Yeah, if you want to do well in America, you need to get some measure of education. If you want to do well in America, someone in the household's got to be working full time. If you want to do well in America, it certainly helps to, get married before you have the baby carriage, coming into the picture, because that, marriage is that institution that strengthens and stabilizes family life. So this is, again, this is kind of like a human point to make. It's not, I'm a Catholic, and certainly I think my faith is integral to my family, but I can also speak as a social scientist and say that, like, look, this is, pretty clear in the data that, education, work, and marriage all independently predict flourishing both financially and emotionally in America today, regardless of whether or not you're a religious person or not.
Yeah. And they kind of build on that quality of responsibility, like you were saying, that is so necessary for continued success. When you have others that you are having to think about consciously, like a wife or children, you are going to, as a byproduct of that, probably perform better at work just because you are no longer only subject to taking care of yourself. Kind of in that same vein, thinking about marriage in terms of affordability, I'm interested to kind of hear your thoughts on the economic pressures kind of surrounding this conversation, because I know you kind of distinguished marriage now as being thought of as a luxury good. So can you talk a little bit about that conception?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges with marriage today is you have kind of like a capstone model of marriage rather than a cornerstone model of marriage that people are kind of operating with. So they kind of think you have to have all your ducks in a row, educationally and professionally and financially. You have to be able to kind of, get married and then move into that nice house in the suburbs. Whereas, for many of us, my wife, and I included, like, when we were first married, we were living in a tiny apartment in Princeton, New Jersey. That was a former, military housing from World War II. Old, decrepit, modest, and everyone was fine. Like, it was, you could do it. So I think just to recognize and appreciate that when it comes to marriage, you should kind of, I think, bring your expectations down financially. You can get married when you're young, and live modestly, but also recognizing too that. Housing is an important part of building a family. And so one of the challenges facing, I think, young adults today is sort of trying to anticipate a time when, as they begin to build their family, they'll be able to access, decent housing for themselves and for their kids. So I think one of the challenges facing the country, now even facing Texas, is how do we create a regulatory context where we are producing single family homes that are modest in size on relatively small, plots of land, and or townhomes as well, that have a couple of bedrooms, often very modest ones, but kind of just give, new families, young families in the working class and the middle class real opportunities to kind of, stake a claim, and to have their own place where they feel like they can, embrace family life and start having the kids that they would like to have. So there's certainly kind of a piece, I think, in terms of trying to figure out policies that promote, again, more modest, reasonably priced single-family homes and townhomes that that Texas as a state, and then kind of towns and cities and localities across the state of Texas should be thinking about how do we and not sort of seeing the answer as we go forward just to like these large homes for more affluent families on the one hand, and cramped, 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, complexes that really serve, singles and childless adults. We have to kind of like understand that, if we want to kind of make our country and make Texas more family friendly, we have to figure out a way to, again, to build single family homes and townhomes that are accessible to working and middle class Americans and Texans.
How would you speak to a family who, as they're kind of conceptualizing these issues, or actually to a young professional who's thinking about families, who maybe is worried about kind of not only the context of affordability and marriage as a luxury good, but also kind of the sacrifice that it would require? And where do you think kind of in careers, maybe young professionals are impeding their own entrance into this world of marriage and family simply because they feel like they would have to sacrifice something personally?
Yeah, so one of the things that kind of struck me in the last month and a half, Hannah, is sort of some of the messages that I've heard from Charlie Kirk in the wake of his death. And I was aware of him, but I wasn't kind of intimately familiar with his messaging around marriage and family. And in the wake of his death, I've kind of listened to a number of his speeches and interviews and kind of discovered how much he was kind of stressing the importance of young adults embracing marriage and family and not kind of ignoring its value and its importance. And he was saying, I think accurately, there's some people out there who think that kind of traveling to Thailand is much more important than kind of getting married and starting a family. That, you're always kind of wanting to do that new thing, that take that new trip, enjoy that new experience, live a certain lifestyle, in a place like downtown Austin, for instance. But in doing that, you're foregoing the opportunity to get married and start a family, and you're missing out on all the benefits that flow from both marriage and parenthood today. So I think we have to recognize that people often see marriage and kids in terms of a transition of loss. I'm going to lose X by becoming a mother. I'm going to lose Y by becoming a dad, or by getting married, rather than a transition of gain. Yes, there are sacrifices entailed by getting married and having kids. Many sacrifices, both I think practically and financially. But what most Americans I think don't always appreciate today is that there's just no question that married men and women, that married fathers and married mothers are doing much better emotionally than their fellow Americans who are single and childless. This is true for 30-somethings, but it's also true for 20-somethings. And if anyone's sort of skeptical listening to this podcast, you can jump on the General Social Survey. It's a reputable survey from the University of Chicago, funded by the federal government, and they ask adults questions every 2 years about a whole range of different issues, including their marital status, their parental status, and their happiness with life in general. And what we see in that data is that, again, the happiest Americans are married fathers and married mothers. And so it's important to just sort of appreciate that, and then to realize, and this is, I think, the most for me, kind of sobering thing about the work I'm doing now is just we're seeing that reports of unhappiness are climbing in America. And they're climbing especially for Americans who are single and childless, where they're 3 and 4 times, more likely to be unhappy with their lives compared to their peers who are married with kids. So I just think, the benefit of kind of having someone to love and be loved by, and then having kids to love and be loved by is incalculable in a sense. And so, yes, you're not going to be traveling to Thailand. Yes, you may have to give up that, beautiful apartment in downtown Austin, but there are real benefits that need to be, I think, foregrounded and comprehended in a day and age when we are seeing happiness in America fall, especially for young adults who are single and childless.
Yeah. What would you say kind of on the flip side, just to pivot a little bit,
sure.
to someone who maybe is totally bought into the idea of marriage and family, but maybe they just can't find, for a lack of a way of saying it better, the right person. How do you kind of encourage someone in that stage of life where they see this as a material good?
So I think there are certainly plenty of young adults that I speak to teaching at UVA who are kind of expressing, concerns about finding someone, to date, mate, and, marry and have kids with. And that's a real challenge. But I think you have to be also deliberate about making an effort. And so I think I was talking to a research assistant of mine at UVA, a little while ago. And I was asking him, like, what's your plan professionally? He had a very detailed plan of, like, he was going to work 2 years and then get a graduate degree in 2 years and then go back to, his job. So it was all mapped out clearly. And I said, well, would you like to get married? He said, oh, yeah, I'd love to get married. And I said to him, are you dating anyone? And he said, no. Have you asked anyone on a date recently? No. So, like, he wasn't really being kind of as deliberate and intentional about dating as he was about his professional kind of career. So I would encourage young adults to be kind of as focused on dating well and dating intentionally with people who are virtuous and, have some long-term potential as they are about kind of how they're approaching, their career. So that's sort of one thing, is kind of being more intentional about dating. And then kind of putting yourself into context where you're more likely to meet people, maybe volunteering on a Saturday morning in some kind of, thing where you're probably going to meet people who are, more marriageable, where you're kind of like looking at in your workplace for people who seem to be, great men or women of character. If you've got a religious bone in your body, going to church on Sunday and plugging into some kind of set of activities at your church community. And then also kind of working with your friends and family too, to kind of have them introduce you to people. I think that's often how people, meet their future spouse as well. So kind of maximizing your odds of kind of these in-person connections that are especially advantageous when it comes to finding someone to date would be, I think, part of what I would say to people about how you can kind of increase your odds of finding someone, and not letting it just sort of go to, to chance. I think particularly today, you need to be more intentional about putting yourself into social and civic, including religious, and professional contexts where you're kind of being surrounded by people who are living virtuous lives, and then also giving people a chance. And I sort of would encourage people to be a little bit more Austinian, as in Jane Austen, where, like, you may not initially think someone is a good match for you or even be interested in them, but you kind of recognize over time, like it's the, classic, Miss Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy, dynamic, where initially there was a lot of friction, a lot of pride and prejudice that was kind of keeping them apart. But over time, they came to realize that, yes, they had their faults, but like this person that they were getting to know better had a lot of virtues as well. And so to be keying on someone who is virtuous and someone with whom you can have a good friendship, and recognizing that no one is going to sort of check off all the boxes. You've got to kind of limit your boxes you're looking to check off if you really want to get married and have a family.
It's interesting that at one point you said, you want to put yourself in a position where you can meet someone that maybe you'd be compatible with in person. So I'm curious kind of for your feedback, especially kind of on this pickiness that I think we see emerging in our culture with online dating, which
Right.
I've heard described as dating on demand. How do you think that online dating kind of plays into this conception?
Yeah, so I think, there's certainly cases. I've got friends who have found their spouses on more like, I'd say, quality dating sites where they're more marriage-minded dating sites. So it's certainly part of the mix. But I would sort of see it as like the backup option, right? So you've been like, you're hitting your mid to late 20s or you're in your 30s and you've tried to kind of plug into, you know, some worthy civic organization or worthy volunteer organization, and you're active in your church, you're reasonably social at your place of business, whatever, but you haven't found a good person. And at that point, there's a new app called Keeper, for instance. It's much more kind of marriage minded. There are religious dating apps. Those would be the kinds of places that I would sort of encourage people to gravitate if that's where they're at. But ideally, you're meeting someone in person in a context where you've got common friends. You kind of have some sense of their reputation in terms of their character, and they're going to, it's in that context where you can at least kind of begin with a baseline of, yes, this person is virtuous and would be a good person, a safe person to date, and go from there. So I think the in-person option is the preferred one. And then the online option is definitely should be like your backup if you're hitting your late 20s or your 30s. And that's because it just tends to be more superficial criteria. And I think oftentimes what we find is that people end up marrying someone who did not check all the boxes, like in their head, but in person they had just qualities of mind and character and common interests. It might be something as prosaic as you love the same college football team, and you enjoy going, and that's actually a meaningful thing. Like if you if you enjoy going to the game, here in Austin on Saturdays, in the fall, that's going to be like a tradition that you're going to build as a couple and as a family. That's great. So I think being open in person to kind of meeting a range of people and just trying to figure out who you'd be, where there's some romantic attraction, but also where there's a lot of, there's a real foundation of friendship.
Yeah. So kind of closing down this conversation, you've indicated kind of Texas as a place where we're kind of uniquely situated to have a reemergence of family. Building that out, what do you think needs to happen for Texas to be the best place in America for families to be built?
Yeah, so what we've seen kind of in our work, Lyman Stone and I, who's also in the Institute for Family Studies, we did a piece on the blue state family exodus. And we made the point that a lot of kind of like the progressive preferred family policies, things like paid parental leave, free school lunches, other kinds of things that were high in the progressive family agenda, were kind of being rolled out in states like Minnesota and states like California and states like New York. And yet families are leaving those states for states like Tennessee, Florida, and Texas. Okay. And so we're thinking about this. What's the dynamic at play here? And so from our perspective, we think what's drawing families to states like Texas is lower cost single family housing. Reasonably lower cost single family housing. Good jobs, low taxes, public safety, and good educational options for their kids. And then just, I think more generally, oftentimes a kind of family-friendly culture, which often has a kind of both today, just to be honest, like a more conservative, coding. I wish it wasn't the case, but it is. It's the way it is today. Conservatives are more likely to be marriage-minded today in America than liberals. And then religious Americans are also more likely to be, marriage and family-minded as well. So I think Texas is appealing as a place that's classically offered better options in housing, low taxes, reasonably good schools, good jobs, and then also kind of that family-friendly culture, and then, strong religious reputation as well. So I think the challenge for Texas is to kind of like not lose some of those attributes as it continues to grow, both in terms of population, in terms of its economy. And so trying to kind of figure out especially how can Texas hold on to its reputation for building and selling, again, single-family homes and townhomes at a reasonable price for kind of middle-class Americans, broadly defined, would be, I think, one key challenge for Texas. The second challenge is, you've pushed through school choice, and that's wonderful, but there are still plenty of schools across the state that are failing, their kids, and so trying to figure out how to continue to sort of improve the quality of education across the state. And then on the cultural front, it's still the case. Texas, as with all states, have seen dramatic declines in marriage and infertility that we saw in the report that we did, here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation last year. And I think that's because there's been a kind of what I call a kind of expressive individualism, that's emerged since the 1970s across the country and here in Texas that sort of exalts doing things, my way, rather than kind of embracing family life. And so I think it's incumbent on public schools in Texas, private schools in Texas, and the state more generally to kind of stress the value of marriage and family life, both in schools, but I also would sort of encourage to think too about some kind of like social media campaign, like around the success sequence, for instance, that would also communicate specifically the value of marriage to young adults too.
I think that's very timely, considering kind of the group of young conservatives that are very much coming forward in line with that quote from Charlie Kirk, get married and have kids, and that sentiment of strong families. And so I think that we have something very exciting in front of us. Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
This has been The Family Front with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.